Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look then at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines with the political correspondent at the Financial Times, Jasmine Chileshe, and the political editor of the Scottish Sun, Rachel Watson, both with us from now until just before midnight. And welcome to both of you. As ever, let's check out the front pages first of all, though. And after Boris Johnson's latest Partygate grilling by MPs in the Commons, the Metro leads with the Prime Minister's own words, "I'm truly sorry." The Guardian quotes Sir Keir Starmer in the debate, labelling Mr Johnson a man without shame. The Eye leads with the comments by former party chief whip Mark Harper that Mr Johnson is not worthy of great office. The Daily Mirror looks ahead to Thursday's vote on whether the PM should face a parliamentary inquiry, listing the reasons why it thinks he should, and tells Tory MPs, you choose. According to The Times, though, those same MPs have already been ordered to block any inquiry. Well, The Telegraph reports that Germany has refused to send heavy arms into Ukraine to bolster its defence, despite other Western countries doing so. While the Daily Mail reports that new rules for self-driving cars will even allow the driver to watch television and browse the web. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch the programme. So let's bring in then the political correspondent at the FT, Jasmine Chileshe, and the political editor of the Scottish Sun, Rachel Watson. Welcome to both of you. So another extraordinary day in Parliament. Rachel, there's the picture of Boris Johnson, front page of the Daily Telegraph. How did he do as he prepares to fly to India?
I think, again, as we saw, and you mentioned there, this wholehearted apology that the Prime Minister gave, but being very defiant in the fact that he wants to remain. And I think what we saw in Parliament was what we've heard over the last couple of days from the Prime Minister and others around him, around the fact that he has apologised for this, he will continue to apologise for this, and that line that he didn't realise that this was a breach of the rules at the time, the rules that he had written. And I think, you know, the fact that there was little more offered than what we've already heard from the Prime Minister, yes, it was the first time dragged to Parliament to give this apology. It was what we've heard over and over again. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from it was actually the performance of Sir Keir Starmer. And I think other of the papers have led on that. The Telegraph lead on the fact that Boris Johnson will still fly off on his visit to India. You know, he is defiant, this is still happening, and he doesn't want the Partygate row to get in the way of his job, and going on this trip cements that and shows that that's what he's doing. But when you look at some of the other kind of comments in the Telegraph go into this as well, the fact that Sir Keir Starmer did really give him enough time in Parliament, as did some others from his own party and the SNP as well. And I think that while the Prime Minister might have hoped that today would put it behind him, we know that there's yet more to come later in the week. And I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon.
Yes, we'll try and tweak your sound. It's not absolutely brilliant, Rachel, but I'm sure we'll get there. So, Jasmine, to you, the fact that he is heading to India, does it show some confidence about the vote on Thursday? This question of whether he deliberately misled Parliament, whether it should be referred to a Commons committee to investigate. That committee could therefore request some of the documents that we've not seen in full, etc., etc. All the parts of the story that means it doesn't go away. But fundamentally, does it mean that they're actually quite confident that those Tory MPs will be voting with and for the Prime Minister?
I think it really shows that the government is keen to show that it's business as usual, and they don't want Partygate to stay in the headlines as much as it is. And they really want to prove that the government does have other priorities, such as addressing the crisis in Ukraine, such as building relationships and strengthening those relationships with countries such as India. But I do think Rachel raises a good point of this isn't actually going to go anywhere. And obviously the PM has given an apology and a statement, but this is only in relation to one fine that was linked to his birthday party. Now, that situation, I think a lot of people can always give him the benefit of the doubt and say, well, he says he was only in the room for 9 or 10 minutes. Is it that bad? I think where things start to get a little bit trickier is when we look at some of these more contentious events, for example, the bring your own wine and beer event. And I think that will be harder for Johnson to justify, and that will be harder to sort of sweep under the carpet. And I think it was quite interesting in the chamber in that I think a lot of Tory MPs at the moment are just sort of waiting and seeing how this all plays out. I think there's a sense of not wanting to criticise the PM too deeply, and that we don't know how local elections will play out. We don't know what will happen in terms of fines. But at the same time, there is a growing discomfort about how long this is going to stretch out for. And I think the fact that we saw someone like Mark Harper, who was a former chief whip, sort of putting his head above the parapet and expressing his discontent with the PM, it doesn't bode well, because this isn't like, for example, with coronavirus, where we saw a very clear faction of MPs that were disgruntled with the PM. We're seeing different types of MPs from different wings of the party slowly sort of voicing their discomfort, slowly putting letters in. And that speaks to the fact that this issue isn't really going away. And it speaks to the fact that the PM still has a lot more work to do to win over those Tory MPs.
Yes, both The Guardian and the inside pages of the Metro, Rachel, pick up on what you brought in too, which is Sir Keir Starmer. The Guardian, a man without shame, and the Metro too, the PM's latest apology is just deflections and distortions. The question is, will they land a hit? Will this make any difference? And has Boris Johnson been permanently holed under the waterline? And we won't necessarily know that yet, will we?
And I think one of the biggest problems with this is when it comes to whether this is a resigning matter or Boris Johnson is forced to go, it's actually down to his Conservative MPs, and that's the biggest issue here. And that's why I think we see this concerted effort from Boris Johnson tonight going to speak to backbench MPs, telling them to vote against this Labour motion that's coming later in the week. A couple of months ago, when it first came out and it first emerged that Boris Johnson had been at some of these parties, there were a number of MPs who raised their head above that parapet and said, we don't think Boris Johnson should be Prime Minister anymore. We know some letters went into the 1922 committee, but we also know some of those people have taken those letters back out, have publicly supported the Prime Minister now, like Douglas Ross, the Scottish Conservative leader, who's done a complete U-turn on what he believed just a couple of months ago. Because it seems like there's a number of issues here, and I think when the Conservatives are looking at it, we've heard a lot about how they don't want to replace Boris Johnson when the war in Ukraine is going on, or the cost of living crisis. They do have the local elections coming up. We just don't know what's going to happen with that. But I think also we've never really seen a real effort from backbench MPs. They've never corralled together. There's never been this movement yet, because there's not a clear successor. So sometimes when you're looking at this and MPs are looking to replace someone, it's because they have someone else that they can back. I think that's one of the biggest problems that we see, is that actually who would it be? Who would everyone throw their support behind? And it's all really to do with what will happen in the local government elections. I think that could be a bit of a turning point for some MPs.
Yes, we saw Rishi Sunak, didn't we, sitting alongside him on the front page of The Guardian there. He's had a very difficult couple of weeks, the successor that was. The Times, certainly, as you mentioned, talks about how Tory MPs are being cajoled to vote a certain way. There had been a call for a free vote come Thursday. And that great guessing game that you mentioned about how many letters Sir Graham Brady has got, we've been playing that for a long time with Theresa May before, have we not? And this question of whether he's still the Heineken politician that can deliver. Do you think the great test will be those May elections and the Wakefield by-election coming up, Jasmine? Or, is it always going to go badly in the midterms, as politicians like to say?
I mean, I think that will be the defence of the Conservative Party. If it does go badly, they'll say we've been in power for a long time. There's always a little bit of a turning against the ruling party. But I think the big question that Tory MPs are asking themselves is Johnson still an election winner? If we look at the polls, we can see that Labour are ahead ever so slightly nationally, but it's not as though this outpouring of criticism has translated into a soaring lead for Labour. So there is a real so MPs are sort of divided, because on one hand, some of them, Tory MPs, feel as though, well, yes, the headlines are bad, but they can point to the vaccine rollout, they can point to the Brexit deal, they feel like they can point to certain policies and say the government is acting. But on the flip side, I think there is a particularly toxic combination of these Partygate headlines alongside cost of living concerns and rising energy bills. And there's a sense that the two of those combined could really impact Johnson in the local elections. And so I think a lot of Tories are sort of holding fire and sort of waiting to see how bad it actually is, because I think as soon as they're convinced that Johnson's no longer the election winner that they assumed he was, I think they'll turn on him pretty quickly.
Yes, there seems to be a long way to run on this still, doesn't there? Jasmine, Rachel, stay there. Lots more still to come, including this on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which reports that Germany is isolated as the West sends heavy arms to Ukraine. Well, welcome back. Watching the press preview with me now, the political correspondent at the Financial Times, Jasmine Chileshe, and the political editor of the Scottish Sun, Rachel Watson. Welcome back to both of you. Let's turn our attention to Ukraine, shall we? Certainly The Guardian talks about the battle for Donbass. Russians overrun a city, they say. The first city to go, Kremenna, a city that had more than 18,000 people in it, became under ferocious Russian attack. The assault, they said, took place from all sides. While The Guardian picks up on the promise of extra help, the US, Britain, Canada, France and Germany all offering extra help. But according to the Telegraph, Jasmine, it's not the heavy arms that Ukraine needs. From Germany, that is. Apologies.
So the Telegraph story is quite interesting because it sort of picks upon some of the divisions that are occurring between Western countries. So it notes that Germany isn't that keen to send reinforcements at the moment. And it mentions Italy is the same as well. And I think at the very beginning of this conflict, we really saw the Western leaders sort of unify together. But it's only inevitable that at this stage in the conflict, as there's been a round of sanctions, there's been a round of conversations between all the countries, that we are starting to see those divisions sort of intensify. And I think it speaks to the fact that Western leaders need to keep having these conversations, need to keep assessing, actually, how can we keep the pressure on Russia? How can we sort of help Ukraine in the best way possible? But I think it shows that actually there still is a lot of work to be done, hence why these discussions are ongoing, and why, say, Johnson, for example, is very keen to sort of reiterate the need to help Ukraine.
Yes, there's always been a very fine line, hasn't there, that defensive weapons were offered, anti-tank missiles, for example, anti being the clue to the defensive nature, and how far you step over the line. Certainly helicopters, howitzers were latest on the list from the Americans to be sent there. But obviously, and Boris Johnson was delayed in the Commons today because he was on a phone call, was he not, with world leaders, including Joe Biden, Rachel. So what more help do you think Britain might choose to offer in this, desperate battle now in eastern Ukraine?
I think, as Jasmine pointed out from the stories for tomorrow, there are countries in the West, the UK, the USA, who are willing to continue providing these defensive weapons to Ukraine. And that's where these lines have been drawn, I guess, with the countries, including Germany. I think the Telegraph piece is really interesting because it talks up the frustrations that Olaf Scholz is facing in his own country, because he thinks that they have maxed out the weapons or the defensive weapons that they can provide to Ukraine, and instead they want to go down the route of providing financial assistance. And I think, as Jasmine said, we will see more of this. We will hear about more meetings, I'm sure, with Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, Olaf Scholz, all the leaders in the West who need to really have this unified position on how they will continue to stand up for Russia.
Apologies for interrupting you. We've run out of time. I do apologise. Rachel Watson, Jasmine Chileshe, thank you both very much indeed. We'll see you soon.